The night air was crisp, the kind that carried a stillness so deep it almost felt sacred. The trees surrounding the cabin stood tall and motionless, their dark silhouettes forming an impenetrable wall against the moonlit sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl let out a solitary call, its haunting echo the only sign of life in the frozen wilderness. Daniel Carter sat inside, the glow of the fireplace flickering across his worn face. He had always found comfort in the solitude of the mountains. The city had been too noisy, too fast, too full of ghosts he didn't want to confront. Out here, in the deep wilderness, time felt suspended. He spent his days tending to his land, chopping firewood, reading old books, and listening to the wind weave its endless stories through the pines. He took a slow sip of whiskey, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. It had been a long time since anything unexpected happened in his quiet corner of the world. Then came the sound, a deep, heavy thud against his porch. Daniel tensed, setting his glass down. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Years of living alone had taught him that every sound had an explanation. But this was different. It wasn't the scurry of a raccoon or the soft pad of a deer. It was heavier, deliberate. He reached for his flashlight and moved toward the window, careful not to disturb the curtains too much. The sight outside made his breath hitch. A bear, a massive grizzly, standing at the edge of his porch, illuminated in the moonlight. Its thick fur was damp with the remnants of melting snow, its powerful frame rising and falling with each heavy breath. But Daniel barely had time to process its presence before his eyes were drawn downward, to the small, unmoving shape at its feet. A cub. It lay limp on the porch, its small chest barely rising. The bear nudged it gently with its snout, letting out a low, guttural sound that made Daniel's stomach tighten. What the hell was he witnessing? Bears didn't do this. They didn't bring their young to humans. They didn't ask for help. And yet, that's exactly what this looked like. The mother bear nudged the cub again, then lifted its head to look at Daniel's window. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no aggression, no challenge. Just something else. Something Daniel couldn't quite name. A plea. He took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter. His mind raced. This could be a trap. An animal's instincts were unpredictable. But the cub was hurt, and the mother wasn't leaving. He exhaled sharply. God damn it, he muttered under his breath. With slow, careful movements, he unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs. The mother bear stiffened but didn't move. He could see the cub better now. Its fur was matted with dried blood, its tiny body barely stirring. Deep claw marks ran along its flank, a clear sign that something had attacked it. Daniel crouched down, keeping his eyes on the mother. His every instinct screamed that this was a mistake, that at any moment, she could decide he was too close. But she didn't move. I don't know what you expect me to do, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. But if I help, you can't kill me for it. He reached out, hesitated, then carefully lifted the cub into his arms. It was warm, but barely. Its tiny heartbeat thudded weakly against his fingers. The mother bear let out a deep exhale, a sound that almost felt like relief. Daniel backed up slowly, cradling the small body against his chest. He stepped inside and shut the door. Inside, the air felt warmer, safer, but his pulse didn't slow. He laid the cub on the worn couch and grabbed his first aid kit, hands moving on instinct. Years ago, before he left his career behind, he had worked in wildlife rehabilitation. He had treated wounded deer, birds, even the occasional bear cub. But he had always worked in controlled environments, never like this. He cleaned the wounds carefully, wincing as the cub let out a weak cry. It was young, too young to be on its own, maybe only a few months old. Outside, the mother bear sat, unmoving, watching through the window. Daniel could feel the weight of her gaze as he worked. He wasn't sure if it was fear, desperation, or something else keeping her rooted there. As he wrapped the last bandage, the cub stirred slightly, its tiny paws twitching. "That's it," he whispered. "You're okay." He sat back, running a hand through his graying hair. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it a sound that sent a chill down his spine. A howl, low and drawn out, distant but unmistakable. Not a wolf, something else. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had been around long enough to recognize the kind of silence that followed a predator's presence. The woods had gone still. Even the mother bear's ears were pricked. Something else was out there, and it wasn't done hunting. Daniel's pulse quickened as the howl faded into the night, swallowed by the silence that followed. It wasn't the cry of a lone wolf marking its territory. No, this was different, lower, stretched too long, filled with something predatory. It wasn't a call. It was a warning. Outside, the mother bear stiffened. Her massive form, already imposing, seemed to grow taller under the glow of the moonlight. Her ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Then, a deep rumble rolled from her chest, a sound so primal that the hairs on Daniel's arms stood on end. She smelled something, and she didn't like it. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned back to the cub, which lay wrapped in a blanket on his couch, its tiny body shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Its breathing was steady now, though still shallow. It wouldn't survive another attack. The mother bear took a step toward the door. Daniel tensed. His fingers brushed the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, a reflex more than a decision. He hadn't fired it in years, but the weight of old instincts settled in his bones. He had lived in these woods long enough to know that when an animal as powerful as a grizzly started showing fear, something worse was lurking in the shadows. Outside, the trees rustled, not with the gentle sway of the wind, but with movement. Calculated, heavy hunting. Daniel moved to the door, pressing his hand against the worn wood. He could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. He wasn't alone. The mother bear let out another growl, low and rumbling. This time it wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. A snap, a twig breaking under deliberate weight. Daniel exhaled slowly. His fingers flexed near the door handle. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to act, to do something. But what? Step outside? Risk provoking whatever was out there? No, that was suicide. He took a step back, his mind racing. He had spent years in these mountains, but there were still things that walked these woods that no man could tame. The bear outside let out a huff, then turned her massive head toward the trees. Her eyes locked on something just beyond the tree line. And then, silence. Not just a pause in the wind or the normal stillness of the forest. A true, unnatural silence. Daniel had heard it before, right before a predator struck. His grip tightened on the doorknob. Then it happened. A blur of movement. A dark shape exploded from the trees, faster than anything that size should have been. The mother bear lunged forward with a roar, muscles rippling beneath her thick fur as she met the attack head-on. Daniel barely had time to react before he was thrown backward by the force of her charge, crashing against the wooden floor. He scrambled up, heart hammering against his ribs, eyes locked on the chaotic clash unfolding just beyond his porch. It was a mountain lion, massive, lean, built for the kill. Its coat was a sleek, ghostly shade of gray, barely visible in the moonlight. It moved like a shadow, muscles coiling and releasing with deadly precision as it danced around the bear's strikes. The mother bear swiped, claws slicing through the air with a force that could shatter bone. The mountain lion dodged, pivoting midair, its razor-sharp teeth flashing as it lunged at her throat. Daniel cursed under his breath. This wasn't just an animal fight. This was personal. This was the same predator that had attacked the cub. And now it wanted to finish what it started. Daniel reached for the rifle, but the second his fingers wrapped around the cold steel, he hesitated. He had never shot an animal in his life. Not once, not in all his years out here. He had learned to respect nature, to understand that everything had its place. But right now, that philosophy didn't mean a damn thing if the bear didn't walk away from this fight. Outside, the battle raged on. The mother bear roared, shaking the trees with the sheer force of her fury. She swiped again, this time connecting. The mountain lion yelped, its body twisting as its hind legs collapsed from the blow. For a brief moment, Daniel thought it was over. But then the lion recovered too quickly. It lashed out in a desperate, savage counterattack, its teeth sinking deep into the bear's shoulder. Daniel moved before he could think. The rifle kicked against his shoulder as he fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the gun shattered the night, and for the first time since the fight began, the mountain lion faltered. It turned its yellow eyes on him, and Daniel felt something cold slither down his spine. That wasn't the look of a wild animal acting on instinct. That was something else. Something calculating. The mountain lion held its gaze on him for a second too long before releasing the bear and slinking backward, muscles rippling as it disappeared into the trees. It didn't run. It didn't panic. It retreated, and Daniel didn't trust that for a damn second. The mother bear stumbled, her massive body heaving from the fight. Blood seeped from the fresh wound on her shoulder, dark against the thick brown fur. She swayed but didn't fall. Daniel's chest tightened. She was hurt, badly, and now he had a choice. Did he help her too? The idea was ridiculous. This was a full-grown grizzly bear, one of the most dangerous creatures on the planet. She had fought off a mountain lion without hesitation, nearly torn it apart with her strength alone. And yet, here she was, bleeding, struggling, not leaving. Daniel set the rifle aside and exhaled. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. The mother bear turned her head toward him, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a second, there was only silence. Then she took a step forward. Daniel tensed, instincts screaming at him to retreat. But he didn't. He stood his ground as she stepped onto the porch, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Then, the most unthinkable thing happened. She lowered herself, not aggressively, not in a way that threatened attack, but in a way that told him everything he needed to know. She was letting him. Daniel inhaled sharply, his pulse hammering. This bear, this wild, untamed creature that should have torn him apart, was trusting him. And suddenly, he realized that this wasn't just about the cub anymore. He wasn't sure why she had come here, why she had chosen him. But something in his gut told him that if he turned her away now, he would never forgive himself. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. The mother bear didn't move, didn't growl, didn't fight. Daniel reached out, and for the second time that night, he made the impossible decision. He was going to save her. Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath. The air was thick with the scent of pine, blood, and the faintest trace of damp fur. His fingers hovered over the mother bear's wound, barely an inch away from her matted fur. The heat radiating off her was palpable, her muscles twitching with each shallow breath. This was insane. Everything in his logical mind screamed that this was suicide. He was standing inches away from a wounded predator, a force of nature that could tear him apart in an instant. But something deeper, something instinctual, kept him rooted in place. She hadn't attacked. She hadn't turned away either. She had chosen to stay. Daniel slowly exhaled and reached for his first aid kit. His hands were steady, his body moving on pure survival instincts now. His days as a wildlife biologist came flooding back, the lessons he had long buried, the procedures he never thought he'd need outside a lab. But there was no sterile operating table here. No team of trained professionals. No sedatives to dull the pain. Just him, a dying bear, and the endless, watching wilderness. He crouched beside her, pulling his knife from his belt. Her breathing hitched as the blade snicked open, but she didn't move, didn't growl. "You're too damn trusting," he muttered under his breath. Carefully, he sliced through the matted fur around her wound, peeling it back to expose the gash beneath. It was bad, deeper than he'd expected. The mountain lion's teeth had torn straight through the muscle, leaving the flesh ragged and raw. Daniel swallowed hard. If he didn't clean it properly, the infection would kill her faster than blood loss. He grabbed a bottle of antiseptic from the kit, hesitated for half a second, then poured. The bear jerked violently, her body seizing as the liquid burned into the wound. A deep, guttural snarl ripped through the air. Daniel froze. For a moment he thought that was it, that she would snap. that his throat would be in her jaws before he could even think to react. But then, something incredible happened. She stilled. She let out a slow, shuddering breath, her paws scraping against the porch wood. Her claws flexed, but she didn't strike. Instead, she settled back down, enduring the pain. Daniel didn't realize he had been holding his breath until he let it out in a quiet, shaky exhale. "That's right," he murmured, voice low and soothing. "You're still here. We're both still here." He worked quickly, his hands moving with purpose now. The bear's chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, her body trembling as he stitched the wound shut. Every so often, she would let out a low growl, her breathing deep and rumbling. But she never moved against him. Somewhere behind them, the cub stirred on the couch, letting out a weak, high-pitched whimper. The mother's ears flicked toward the sound. Daniel tightened the final stitch and sat back. "There," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "That'll hold." He expected her to move then, to get up, to reclaim her place by her cub. But she didn't. She just looked at him. A deep, penetrating stare, like she was trying to understand him. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Something unfamiliar. He had spent years in isolation, avoiding people, avoiding responsibility. The last time he had cared about another living thing, he had ended up burying it. That had been the last straw, the moment he had packed his bags, left behind the life he had built, and disappeared into the wilderness. It was easier that way. It was supposed to be easier. But now, staring into the dark eyes of this massive, wounded creature, he felt something stir, something dangerous. He gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "What the hell are we doing here?" he murmured. The bear blinked, slow and deliberate, before lowering her head onto the porch with a heavy sigh. Daniel leaned against the railing, running a hand down his face. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was until now. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving his limbs heavy and his mind fogged with exhaustion. He turned his head slightly, gazing out at the treeline. The mountain lion was still out there. It had chosen to leave, and that was what worried him most, because predators didn't retreat unless they planned to come back. The night stretched on, thick and heavy with an unspoken weight. Daniel didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the porch with the bear, listening, waiting. The cub had finally drifted into a deep sleep, its tiny body curled up on the couch inside. The mother bear still hadn't moved from her spot, though her breathing had evened out slightly. The wound wasn't bleeding anymore, which was good. But she wouldn't be able to fight, not like this. Not if the lion returned. Daniel adjusted his grip on the rifle. The old, familiar weight felt unnatural in his hands. He had always sworn he wouldn't use it unless absolutely necessary. But tonight he wasn't sure if he had a choice. A sharp crack echoed through the trees. Daniel's breath hitched. The bear's ears flicked. Another snap. Closer this time. Daniel rose to his feet, every muscle in his body coiled tight. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. But the shadows remained still, shifting only with the wind. And then a growl. "Low, close." Daniel's fingers curled around the trigger. The mother bear lifted her head, letting out a deep, warning rumble of her own. Then a shape stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. Not the mountain lion. Something else. Daniel's stomach dropped. A second predator. It was bigger than the first. Darker. More muscular. Its golden eyes flickered in the moonlight, sharp and knowing. It wasn't hunting. It was waiting. A cold chill crawled down Daniel's spine. They had been wrong. The first attack, it hadn't been random. It had been a test. A distraction. Daniel took a slow step back, gripping the rifle tighter. His mind worked fast, calculating. He had one shot before things turned ugly. The bear beside him rose to her feet. She was weak, wounded, but she didn't retreat. She stood beside him, her massive frame towering over his. Daniel exhaled. "All right then," he murmured, leveling the gun. The predator took another step forward. The real fight was just beginning. The night held its breath. Daniel could feel it in his bones. the weight of something ancient, something primal lurking in the darkness. The predator in the trees was different from the first. Bigger, smarter, patient. It wasn't here to chase off a wounded bear or to scavenge an easy kill. This one was here to finish what the first had started. Daniel swallowed against the tightness in his throat. His rifle was steady, his finger hovering just above the trigger. The mother bear stood beside him, her breathing ragged but her stance unwavering. Even in her weakened state, she would fight. And if it came to that, so would he. The shadows shifted. A pair of golden eyes flickered between the trees. Then another set. Daniel's pulse stuttered. 2 of them. The realization struck like a punch to the gut. This was no random hunt. This was coordinated. A distraction. A test. A setup. The first mountain lion had been a scout, sent to assess the threat, to wound, to weaken. The real hunters had been waiting. Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. For years, he had thought himself untouchable out here. Safe. He had built his world on the assumption that the wilderness would leave him alone if he respected it in turn. That the ghosts of his past would stay buried in the soil. But nature had no rules, no morals. It was brutal, unforgiving, and now it had come knocking at his door. The mother bear rumbled low in her throat, her ears pinned back. She felt it too, the slow unraveling of the night, the inevitable violence curling at the edges of the dark. Daniel exhaled slowly. If he missed his shot, it was over. A snap of movement, one of the lions lunged. Daniel fired. The gunshot shattered the silence, a crack of thunder rolling through the trees. The muzzle flash illuminated the clearing for a fraction of a second. The bullet missed by inches. The lion twisted midair, avoiding the shot with unnatural reflexes. It hit the ground running, closing the distance between them in seconds. Daniel barely had time to move. The mother bear did. With a snarl that shook the earth, she charged. Her massive form crashed into the oncoming predator with devastating force, knocking it off its trajectory. The 2 beasts collided like a thunderclap, claws flashing, teeth sinking into fur and flesh. Daniel stumbled back, pumping the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. He had lost control. The second lion struck. It came from the side, a streak of shadow against the snow. Daniel spun, raising the gun too slow. It was on him. The impact sent him sprawling. The world tilted and shattered as he hit the frozen ground. Hard. The breath was knocked from his lungs. A snarl, hot breath, the weight of a predator on his chest. Daniel's mind fractured into survival mode. The lion's claws raked across his jacket, slicing through fabric. Teeth snapped inches from his face. He fought with everything he had. He threw his elbow into the lion's throat, forcing it back just enough to free his arm. His fingers found the knife at his belt. A last, desperate move. The lion lunged again. Daniel drove the blade upward. It sank into flesh, a screech of pain. The weight on his chest lifted as the predator twisted away. Thrashing. Daniel rolled onto his knees, gasping for breath. His vision swam. The lion staggered, dark blood glistening against the snow. But it wasn't dead. Not yet. The mother bear was still fighting the first one, her roars shaking the ground. She was winning, but barely. Too wounded. Too slow. Daniel forced himself up, lungs burning. The second lion was circling now, wary of him. It knew he was dangerous now, but it also knew something else. He was weak, and it was right. His limbs felt heavy, his ribs screaming from the impact of the fall. He couldn't do this. But then, a sound. Small, fragile, a whimper. Daniel's head snapped toward the cabin. The cub. It had woken up, its tiny body trembling as it stared at the chaos outside. Its wide, frightened eyes darted from the mother bear to Daniel to the blood in the snow. And suddenly, everything was different. Daniel wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He wasn't just fighting for the mother bear, either. He was fighting for something that hadn't asked for this. Something innocent. Something that still deserved a chance to live. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Come on," he growled under his breath. "Come on, you son of a..." The lion charged. Daniel didn't run. He braced. At the last second, he sidestepped, lifting the rifle like a club. The wood cracked against the lion's skull. The predator collapsed, disoriented for a split second. That was all he needed. Daniel dropped the rifle and grabbed his knife. He lunged, slamming the blade home. The lion let out a final, shuddering breath. Then it went still. Daniel collapsed beside it, chest heaving. His vision blurred, his body screaming in protest. He couldn't move. The fight was over, or so he thought. A roar. Daniel's head snapped up. The mother bear had pinned the first lion. Its body was limp beneath her massive paws, its throat torn open. It was dead. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the bear turned to him. Daniel forced himself upright, his muscles burning. His hands were slick with blood, his own, the lion's, maybe both. The bear stared at him, her deep, dark eyes unreadable. They had fought together. They had bled together. And they had won. Daniel let out a weak, breathless laugh, shaking his head. "What the hell are we doing?" he muttered, voice hoarse. The bear huffed, a deep exhale that sent a plume of warm air into the night. Then slowly she turned. She limped toward the cabin, toward the cub. Daniel followed. His steps were slow, exhausted, but he followed, because somehow, against all logic, against all odds, this was no longer just about survival. This was family, and neither of them were alone anymore. The dawn broke slowly, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and violet. The first light of morning crept through the trees, casting long shadows over the blood-stained snow. The air was still, thick with the scent of earth, iron, and survival. Daniel stood on the porch, his body aching, his breath slow and measured. The weight of the night pressed against him, but something had shifted, something he couldn't name. Inside, the cub stirred, letting out a soft, sleepy sound. The mother bear lay beside it, her wounds bound, her massive frame rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a long time, Daniel just watched them, watched the way the cub nestled into its mother's warmth, watched the way she led it. She had trusted him. That trust had saved them all. The realization settled deep in his chest, a quiet, unshakable truth. The mother bear turned her head then, her dark eyes finding his. There was no fear between them now, no hesitation, just understanding. Daniel exhaled. "Go on," he murmured. She hesitated only a moment longer before pushing herself up, slow but steady. The cub followed, small paws pressing against the wooden floor. At the doorway, she paused. She looked at him one last time, and then she was gone. The trees swallowed them whole. Daniel stood there, the wind brushing against his face, whispering through the pines. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And somehow he knew neither did she.